Welcome to Unit 3. In this video, we'll be talking about some of the basic elements of fair division. When we talk about fair division, we need to be able to answer the question, what is a fair share? In order to answer this question, we need to be able to discuss three main components of fair division: assets, players, and value systems. With assets, we will talk about two different types. The first type is called continuous. Continuous assets are divisible in infinitely many ways. One example of this would be land. If we had land that we needed to divide among investors, we could draw the lines anywhere we want. We could even have super tiny pieces of land and super big pieces of land. It's divisible in infinitely many ways. Another example will be cake. And we will actually use cake a lot in this unit because it's easy to picture and easy to draw. Anything that can be divided in any kind of way is a continuous asset. The second type of asset that we will talk about is discrete. Discrete assets are not divisible in infinitely many ways. Rather, it's a collection of indivisible objects. Objects that would maybe lose all of their value if we were to chop them up into pieces. These are items like paintings, artwork, houses, jewels, jewelry, anything that can't be chopped up into a bunch of pieces and shared. In fair division, there's also players. Players can be individuals, families, institutions, or even countries. And each of these individual players has their own value system, and that will be important as we head into this unit. One player might value things differently than another. And all that matters is that each player gets a fair share based on their own definition of fair and their own value system. So what is a fair share? If we have n people, that is 3, 4, 10, 55, then a fair share for those people is any share that, in the opinion of the individual player, has a value that is at least 1/n of the total value of all the items. Let's look at these example scenarios to see what we mean here. If there's two players, a fair share would be 50-50. So as long as each of the players receives 1/2 or 50% of the total value, then they're happy and they got their fair share. If there's three players, that is our n is equal to 3, then a fair share would be 1/3 or 33 1/3%. And if there's 8 players, that is n is equal to 8, then a fair share would be 1/8 or 12.5%. As long as each player, based on their own value system, gets 12.5% of the total value of all the assets, then they got their fair share. In scenario 4, we have that you and your 3 siblings are dividing a piece of land among yourselves. Well, that means there's 4 siblings total dividing up a piece of land. In other words, n here equals 4. So a fair share needs to be 1/4 or 25% of the total value. So you will end up with a portion of land that is worth at least 25% of the total value to you. And each of your siblings would get a portion of the land worth at least 25% of the value to them. Do your siblings need to view your share at 25%? Absolutely not. It doesn't matter at all what anyone else thinks about the value of your share. All that matters is what you think about your share. Do you need to view your siblings' share at 25% each? Absolutely not. All that matters is what they think about their individual shares and its value being at least 25%. A fair division method or a fair division game guarantees that each player will receive a fair share of the assets. As long as the steps are followed correctly, everyone ends up with at least their fair share and quite possibly much more. In order for these games to work, or these fair division methods, there's a few assumptions that we need to be able to make. First, we're going to assume that players are rational. Hopefully they're going to behave themselves and make decisions and evaluations that fall within some reasonable guidelines. We're also going to assume that players are willing to cooperate with one another and cooperate with the steps of the method. One part of cooperating is that players will respect the privacy of others. It's important that players do not know the evaluations that other players are making because then they could manipulate the situation. And finally, we're going to assume that players have equal rights in sharing. These are not weighted voting systems where some players have more power than others. Let's head into an example. Henry, Koo, and Tia are breaking up a partnership and dividing among themselves the partnership's real estate assets. They're equally owned by the three of them. The assets are divided into 3 shares, S1, S2, and S3. The table below shows the values of the shares to each player expressed as a percent of the total value of the assets. Which of the shares is fair to Henry? Well, if there's 3 players, then a fair share needs to be 1/3 or 33 1/3% of the total value. To Henry, share number 1 is only worth 25% of the total value, so that's not a fair share. But in Henry's eyes, S2 is worth 40%, so that's a fair share. And S3 is worth 35%, so that's a fair share. Now let's ask the same question for Koo and Tia. To Koo, S1 is only worth 28%. That's less than 33 1/3, so S1 would not be considered a fair share to Koo. But both S2 and S3 are worth more than 33 1/3%, so those are fair shares, and he would be happy with one of those. For Tia, each share is worth 33 1/3% exactly. In other words, Tia would be happy with any of the 3 shares. So what are all possible fair divisions here? Well, definitely S1 should go to Tia because Tia is the only one that values S1. Then S2 and S3 could go to either Henry or Koo. So we have 2 options here. S2 can go to Henry, while S3 goes to Koo. Or S3 could go to Henry, while S2 goes to Koo. Either of those would be considered fair because everyone gets a fair share based on their own personal value system. Now, which one of these is the best? Consider that Henry values S2 at 40%, which is more than the valuation for S3. Koo values S3 a little bit more than S2. So the best fair division here would be to go ahead and give Henry S2, Koo S3, and Tia S1. That's this first fair share that we listed here. And that covers all of the key elements for fair division.